Hello again, and thank you for joining me for the Daily Bread Bible Study. This is day 197 for Wednesday, July 15th, 2020, focusing on Isaiah chapters 4 through 8. We pick it up in verse 5 of chapter 4, which says, "Then the Lord will create the whole site of Mount Zion and over its places of assembly, a cloud by day and smoke and the shining of a flame fire by night. Indeed, over all the glory there will be a canopy." Now, this is the imagery that harkens back to the wilderness when the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness and God is leading them by the cloud and by the pillar of fire. And they are going towards the promised land, towards God's blessings, especially God's blessings as promised to Abraham there for these Israelites who have previously been slaves in Egypt. So, Isaiah is hearkening back to their roots and also then invites them to move forward out of their dysfunction. In Isaiah chapter 5, in verse 4, it says, "I expected to yield grapes. Why did it yield wild grapes?" Now, this is a metaphor of an unsuccessful vineyard attempt. Isaiah expressing God's disappointment for his people. God did all the work to cultivate the people into those who would follow him. He gave what was promised to Abraham, gave the descendants, gave the wealth, the land, and made them a great nation. Yet, in their blessings, they rebelled against God's wishes, falling into bloodshed and dismay, instead of going with justice and righteousness. Therefore, God is going to tear down what currently exists, those who, in verse 21, are wise in your own eyes and shrewd in your own sight. Isaiah chapter 6 continues saying, here we have the call story of the prophet Isaiah, a vision of God in his heavenly court. The sounds of worship are there in this imagery that Isaiah experiences. The angels are there singing, "Holy, holy, holy," the sound of worship. God's prophets, the prophet responds with a sense of awe in God's presence, saying in verse 5, "Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Now, to fix this problem, God purifies Isaiah's tongue with an ember of fire. And when God seeks to send someone to send, Isaiah responds, "Here I am, send me." Isaiah having his mouth purified, able to speak God's words on God's behalf. God then instructs the prophet what is to come and lays out his plans for purification of the wayward Israelites. In Isaiah 6:9, it says, He said to him, "Go and say to this people, keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand." A quote of Jesus as well, too. "Make the mind of this people dull and stop their ears. Shut their eyes so that they may not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and comprehend with their minds and turn and be healed." So the idea is that these people are set on their ways. They think their wisdom is the best, and God is going to prove their folly of their ways and invite them to turn to God's wisdom instead of their own in order to be healed. This also continues in the work of the prophet. In Isaiah chapter 7, we go back to the time of King Ahaz. And remember, Isaiah has some interactions with King Ahaz here. But this King Ahaz, he is an unfaithful leader, as stated in 2 Kings 16, because there is where he builds a replica of an altar in Damascus, there in the Temple of Solomon. He basically kicks God over for this god of Assyria. And then in 2 Chronicles 27, We also see more dysfunction by King Ahaz, that he is afraid of the Edomites and asks Assyria for help, and this leads only to more destruction and plundering for Judah. So here in Isaiah chapter 7, we have this character of this unfaithful king receiving counsel from a faithful prophet. The circumstances then, going back to the time where the Edomites and let's go back to it. What does it call them there? Ephraim as well too. So it says that Ephraim and Aram had allied themselves, and here's an interaction with King Ahaz, worried about getting destroyed by these joined forces. In Isaiah 7 verse 3 it says, "Then the Lord said to Isaiah, Go out to meet Ahaz, you and your son Shear-Jashub, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool of the highway to the fuller's field. And say to him, Take heed, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint, because these two smoldering stumps of firebrands, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah." So these joined forces of Aram. In verse 14 it says, God will give a sign. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child, and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. Now this here in chapter 7 verse 14, very famous for us Christians. In the Gospel of Matthew, it's referenced here as Jesus the coming Emmanuel. Emmanuel is a name which means God is with us. And so the idea of a young woman, which could be translated as virgin, we're not really sure of the relations that this woman has had, but a young woman will bear a child and shall have a son and name him Emmanuel. It further describes this Emmanuel that he shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. And before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose kings you are in dread will be deserted. So we see that the prophet Isaiah is giving advice to King Ahaz here in Isaiah chapter 7. We also know that this reference is what is used to describe Jesus as Emmanuel, God with us, born to the Virgin Mary through our tradition. And so this Emmanuel, who will be very intelligent at a young age, and also show that by the time he is able to discern for himself that the threat that this faithless King Ahaz is worried about will go away. So let me talk a little bit about the role of prophecy. Prophets are called simply to speak on behalf of God. We as individuals often look at prophets and try and interpret what they say for our day and time. This is exactly what happened with Jesus, as people were looking for signs of who Jesus was and trying to validate who Jesus being God's son, and claimed that he was something that had been alluded to by the prophet Isaiah. That was very important for the New Testament writers to try and claim that Jesus was destined by the prophet Isaiah. Now, the hard part is when we get to chapter 8, because the one named Emmanuel is born. It says in verse 3 of chapter 8, "And I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. And then the Lord said to me, Name him Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. For before the child knows how to call my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away by the king of Assyria." So we see that this child is actually born in Isaiah in this book. He's not necessarily named Emmanuel, but Emmanuel is kind of a token name. Also, this Mahir Shalal Hashbaz is referencing just the role that this child plays in the story of Isaiah. So, picking it up in verse 7 and 8 of chapter 8 of Isaiah, therefore the Lord is bringing up against it the mighty floodwaters of the river, the king of Assyria in all his glory. It will rise above all the channels and overflow all its banks. It will sweep on into the Jordan, or Judah, as a flood, and pour over. It will reach up to your neck, and outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. So the land, O Emmanuel, makes me think that the people are the chosen of God here. And so I think there's all sorts of imagery happening. There's all sorts of metaphor that's being alluded to. This imagery of the king of Syria being like a flood upon the land is important as well too. We know that Assyria will essentially lead to the downfall there of Israel, and also that Babylon will come along and sack Judah a little bit later. So, the idea is that these people have fallen away from God, and that God is sending a sign in order to be a sign of God's activity and God's deliverance in that moment. That is the theme that is picked up in the New Testament, in the writer, the Gospel of Matthew. This theme that God will send a sign and that God will provide God's own deliverance. So while it may not be, something that I think necessarily supports a virgin birth model or the Bible is not necessarily trying to be consistent within all of its stories. But what it is trying to do is to say that God is active and alive, both here in the story of Isaiah through the birth of this child named Emmanuel or Mahir Shalal Hashbaz, and also with what is happening with Jesus, that Jesus is something special about what God is doing there in the world, and he is not to be overlooked or disregarded either. So may you be able to find prophetic words that speak in your day and life. That's why we read the Bible, is because the Spirit continues to interpret these stories for our times and our day and give us guidance in our lives. So through all of this, may you find guidance and God's peace and God's wisdom here. And until we have a blessed day, until we meet for our next Daily Bread Bible study.